So you're probably familiar with all sorts of historical dagger, but in this video we're going to look at a type of dagger which actually was used in Europe and Japan, at least a family of daggers, that you might not know about. And no, it's not this one that I'm holding. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, we've looked at many types of swords on this channel over the years and various other types of edged weapons, and of course daggers have featured very prominently in that because daggers are super important all over the world. Knives and daggers are one of the most fundamental weapons, and you could say in themselves gave rise to swords ultimately. So while we focus a lot on swords in this channel, in some ways daggers historically across the world, across history, kind of more important. And certain other weapons are as well, but we'll come back to that in a second. So you'll be familiar with various types of historical dagger, like this left-hand parrying dagger, for example, usually coupled with a side sword or a rapier. But we're not going to talk any more about that. But interestingly, at certain points in history, it's become necessary to develop specific types of dagger which are specialised thrusting implements. In some cases, they don't really even have much or any cutting capacity, and that is usually, not always, but usually because of armour. And the most famous example, which you'll probably immediately be thinking of, is the famous rondel dagger, okay, which is specialised really to punch through chainmail, mail as it should be called, or even padded armour, layers, jacks, this type of thing, gambeson. And this is a specialised fighting dagger of the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, used in Europe, but we weren't the only people to come up with this. That being said, this is a specialised dagger for a specialised purpose, and we'll come back to that topic a little bit in a couple of minutes. But sometimes people used things as daggers which weren't actually intended as daggers, and that's what we're actually looking at here. So what could you possibly use as a dagger that isn't already a dagger? Well, I'm going to reach off screen slightly and grab an example right here. This is an original antique Edo period Japanese Yari. Okay, now it should be fairly self-evident. In my study, this is fairly confined spaces, obviously, to be waving a spear around. This is, in case you're wondering, just over the height of me. I'm 6'1", so this is about 6'3", something like that. And it's full length with the original shaft. It's got the rattan binding, which is lacquered on it, and then it's got a red oak shaft underneath with the copper binding. It is a, in case you're wondering, a fukuru Yari, which means that it has a socket. Now we'll come back to this in a second, but most Japanese Yaris have a tang, but some Japanese Yari, like this example, fukuru means essentially like sock or sleeve, have a socket like a European spear. So how on earth does this relate to daggers? Well, in Japan, sometimes when they needed a specialised thrusting dagger, somewhat akin to a rondel dagger, they took a Yari blade and mounted it into a dagger hilt. Okay, now you may know that a Japanese dagger or knife is called a tanto, and so quite simply they call this a Yari tanto. Okay, it's as simple as that. It's literally spear dagger. So they take one of these blades and they mount it up as a dagger. Now I don't have an example, unfortunately. I've been trying to get one for a few years, but I haven't been able to get my hands on one. But they don't usually use the fukuru, the socketed style of Yari. I actually have a Yari blade here, and again an original antique one with the tang. Now obviously this doesn't have a shaft, but that makes it somewhat easier to demonstrate on screen within the confines of my study here. Now this is a fairly typical, you'll notice the Yari blade is a triangular section blade. It looks almost like a chisel, to be honest, but it's incredibly stiff. Now you will of course notice, and you'll know from watching other videos on my channel, that certainly the Japanese weren't the only people to come up with a triangular section blade when they wanted maximum stiffness and penetration. Of course, bayonets, socket bayonets are usually triangular, very often triangular anyway, in Europe. And certain other things, small swords for example, if I point at that example there, that is a triangular section blade. So small swords, bayonets, and sometimes other things as well, estocks for example, can have triangular section blades because they're incredibly stiff, rigid, very good therefore for penetration, and also very strong as well. They're also kind of difficult to make, particularly with the heat treatment, because they're asymmetrical. They tend to kind of banana a bit. But anyway, that's a topic for another video. So this is obviously a specialized thrusting implement because it's a spear. Now you'll notice it has a long tang. Now, as mentioned, this is a fukuru, I sort of struggle with the Japanese words, fukuru or socketed spearhead. So this doesn't have a tang going down inside, but usually these will be mounted so the tang is concealed inside the shaft down here, and there is a pin or peg going through the tang. You'll notice it has a there, Makugiana, in fact, where the Makugi peg goes through, just the same as on a Japanese sword. And that is a very strong method of construction, but it does often require, so that the shaft doesn't split, it does often require a separate sleeve, which is almost undoubtedly how they ended up with these Fukuru Yari at a later point. So what do you do if you want to, well, first of all, why? Why would you want to use this? Well, first of all, hold on, let's put this blade down and let's just grab a wakizashi. I don't have a tanto to hand, but a wakizashi. Okay, so this is an Edo period wakizashi. Now, Japanese blades, by and large, are mostly focused on cutting. Okay, they do obviously have points and they are used for thrusting as well, but they're not fantastically well adapted to penetrating things like armor, particularly mail. They had mail, aka chainmail, and various other forms of armor in Japan. So if you want a specialized thrusting implement, in fact, the best specialized thrusting implement in Japan is the spear or pike with this type of Yari tip on. Now there are various types of Yari. We might do a dedicated video. If you want me to do a dedicated video on Yari, incidentally, they're a fascinating topic, get posting down below. So obviously you take one of these blades and you think, well, that would make a brilliant blade for stabbing with because it's a spear, much like a rondel dagger blade, but you've got a tang that's too long, so you shorten off the tang, literally just saw it off here, you put a new hole through the tang here, this is soft iron, and then you mount it onto a tanto hilt. And lo and behold, you end up with something very, very similar, in fact, to a rondel dagger, even to the point that sometimes they even have a little Tsuba guard on, so they actually really become quite like a rondel dagger, for the same reasons as the rondel dagger developed in Europe. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this wasn't just something found in Japan. So while the Yari tanto is fascinating and really, really cool, and maybe when I get hold of one we can do a deeper dive into them, they weren't the only ones to do this. Now, how do I know this? Well, funnily enough, I was researching on Norse sagas, Icelandic sagas, various myths and legends related to what commonly would be called Vikings, but let's call them Norse, Scandinavian people. And I found, interestingly, there is a story regarding Lagertha. Now, if you've watched the series Vikings, the many, many seasons of it, you will know that one of the main characters of that is Lagertha. Now, Lagertha's life in that TV show doesn't exactly tally with the stories. However, there is a story. In one version of the story of Lagertha's life, is she basically has an argument with her husband and kills him, okay? But here's the interesting bit for the purposes of this video. She kills him with a spearhead. So she actually uses a spearhead concealed in her clothes, her gown perhaps, or whatever she's wearing. She uses a spearhead and uses it as a dagger, which I think is absolutely fascinating because I just so happen to have a 15th century replica spearhead here, which will go on a spear shaft, but it isn't on a shaft yet. And it's a pretty good dagger because obviously if you take the head off a spear shaft, you've still got a thrusting point, and it's something that's quite concealable. It has in Europe a socket rather than a tang, so it has a ready-made grip on it. If you take this off your shaft, off your quarterstaff for example, and conceal it somewhere, it becomes a dagger. If it's not on a spear shaft, it is a de facto dagger. So there we go. And we actually have this example from Viking era. Well, it was written down later, but oral tradition from the Viking period and written down really in the 12th and 13th centuries. We have this tradition of a spearhead being used in Europe as a dagger. Do you know of any other examples? There might be some people watching this video who know of other examples of spearheads being used as daggers. I don't know. I'm certain, because it's such a logical, easy thing, there must be other examples out there from history. So I'd really love to hear about them if you find them. Okay, maybe you know other examples from Icelandic sagas or Norse sagas. Maybe you know of examples from Africa or elsewhere in Asia, you know, India or something like this. I don't know. It's a fascinating topic, but I do find it interesting that the Viking era Europeans, at least Lagertha, came up with the same idea as the sort of Sengoku and later Edo period Japanese of using, in their case, a Yari blade mounted into a dagger hilt and using a spearhead as a dagger. So there we go. Did you know about that? Did you know about either of these? I suspect that some of you knew about Yaris used as daggers, but not many of you knew that there was at least one example from Europe of a spearhead being used as a dagger. Did you know? Get posting down below. If you know there are other examples from other places or other times, I'd absolutely love to hear about it. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.